And so, they all got together. All the students in the class got together. And they decided that they were going to do a joint project. And the subject of the experiment, the subject of the project was going to be the teacher. And what they were going to try to do, the goal they were aiming for by the end of the semester was to teach the teacher to climb the wall on the right-hand side of the classroom. Now, you might think this is bizarre, but hardly more bizarre than teaching the pigeon to play ping pong. And the way they did it, they all got it together among themselves. They didn't tell the teacher about this, of course. And so what they did was, for the first week, they were going to arrange that when the teacher was looking to the right or stepping to the right, they would all pay really close attention. And they would ask really good questions. They'd be really attentive. And when the teacher looked to the left or stepped to the left, they'd doze off or they'd knock their books on the floor. And the teacher, not at all aware of what was happening, just kind of found himself gravitating toward the right. Okay, this went on for a week or two. Then they raised the bar. Now the teacher actually has to be in contact with the wall on the right side of the classroom. Okay? So the teacher's walking this way, no particular response, just a neutral response. But just by chance, the teacher leans on the wall, and all of a sudden, boy, they're listening, they're hanging at their edges of their seats, they're hanging on every word. They're the best students he's ever encountered. All right? Week later, they up the ante. He's got to have one hand above his head on the wall. Okay? Same sort of thing. He has no idea what's going on. And he's not even aware that he's spending so much time on the right-hand side of the class. But he's convinced, boy, he is a really good teacher. Now, he's got to have both hands on the wall. Okay? He finds it a little bit awkward. But hey, he gets used to it. Then, both hands and one foot. At that point, they declared the experiment a success. They knew they really couldn't get him up the wall. That would defy laws of physics, but not laws of psychology. Other questions, perhaps more closely connected to the present. Yes?
My mother is originally from Mobile, Alabama, and moved back there after my dad died in '91. And all of my southern relatives continue to this day to refer to the Civil War as the recent discomfort between the states. And where I'm going with this is in talking about the civil rights and what happened. Last night, and it was something that I just caught on the national news before coming down here, they were noting that something happened last night that has some of the Democratic Party quite upset, which is that 90% of the black vote went to Obama and 75% of the white vote went to Clinton, and they're not sure what this could mean in a general election.
This gets at the original theme of the lecture. What do you make of democracy? Obviously, it's an aspect of democracy that people get to vote for whomever they want to vote for whatever reason they vote for. And here I'm going to make a point to you that I make to my students. One of the peculiarities of, what shall I call it, a pluralist democracy like the United States, where there are lots of different views and lots of different interests. When it comes to electing people or voting for or against pieces of legislation, we don't inquire into the motives for the vote. All we do is count the votes. And the most votes wins. When I was talking about Johnson and civil rights, why did Everett Dirksen vote the way he did? Why did the other supporters of the bill vote the way they did? Did they think it was right? Were they afraid that Lyndon Johnson was going to react against them, retaliate against them if they didn't go along? I don't know. And from the purposes of Lyndon Johnson, it doesn't make any difference. He got the votes he wanted. But what does it mean when people do vote on well, let's just suppose this poll is accurate, and let's suppose that this carries forward. And what if it becomes the case that Barack Obama is the candidate of Black America and Hillary Clinton is the candidate of white America? Suppose this goes into the general election. And suppose it becomes the case that Barack Obama is the candidate of Black America and John McCain is the candidate of white America. What do we make of this? There are very few people, I think, who would say, oh, that's great. No, this causes people a lot of concern. And this is, I mean, you raised the question, I think, because you're at least somewhat concerned about it.
Absolutely.
And people have good reason for concern. And I'll come back to this in just a moment, but before I do, I want to point out that you can interpret the Civil Rights Bill that Lyndon Johnson was instrumental in passing as a triumph of democracy or as an abuse of democracy. It's a triumph of democracy if you look at American democracy as a national thing, where the will of the nation as a whole, as mobilized in the federal Congress, should prevail. But there were plenty of people in the South who defended the Southern way of doing things as an exercise in local democracy, in democracy at the state level. And the segregationist laws that were in force in every state of the South were popular laws. They were laws passed by a majority of those states. Majorities in those states. And yeah, you can argue that, okay, well, blacks were disenfranchised, so it wasn't an honest majority, but hey, even if blacks had had the vote, they didn't have the numbers to prevent these laws from being passed. And this goes back to the start of the lecture. Who was right? James Buchanan or Abraham Lincoln? James Buchanan almost certainly was correct that opposition, armed opposition to secession, was unpopular. And if put to a vote, Americans wouldn't have supported it. Abraham Lincoln didn't have popular support, at least not at first. So, and the whole question of secession. Secession was justified by the seceding states on grounds of democracy. Hey, democracy is all about self-government. Shouldn't South Carolina, shouldn't Virginia, shouldn't Mississippi, shouldn't Texas have the right to determine the government they should live under? That's the fundamental premise of democracy. So how do you divide this stuff up? And what happens, to come back to your question, what happens if democracy produces results you don't like? What happens if democracy produces results you find abhorrent? What do you do? Do you throw out democracy? Do you change the rules? Do you simply grin and bear it? I don't have the answer. It's something that everybody living in a democracy needs to consider now and then, though. And it gets back to this question, the origin of all of this, where President Bush, with good reason, I think, is promoting democracy in the Middle East. And comparatively speaking, American democracy has worked pretty well. Yeah, pretty well over the long run. There were some rough patches like, well, the Civil War. And it's probably fair to say that democracies tend to be more peaceful than authoritarian regimes. But even that's kind of problematic because, do you remember, not from real life, very many of you, any of you perhaps, but from your study of history, how Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany? He was elected. Okay? Now he later, but through parliamentary means, suppressed German democracy, but the Germans voted themselves a Nazi government. What do you do in a case like this? What do you do when the Palestinians hold democratic elections and elect Hamas, a terrorist group? What do you do in this case? I don't know. I have the luxury as a history professor, as a mere history professor, the luxury of irresponsibility. I can raise these questions. I don't have to provide any answers.